Hello, everybody, and welcome to my presentation on the impact of teacher-directed violence on burnout, turnover, and a national teacher shortage. So I want to begin this presentation with my purpose. I had found an abundance of literature that examined students as victims of school violence, and we all too frequently see the media outlets reporting on the worst instances of school violence, namely shootings. However, there is a lack of literature that investigates violence towards school personnel and the implications that teacher directed violence has for schools. During the pandemic, 1/3 of teachers reported that they experienced at least one incident of verbal harassment or threat of violence. Teacher directed violence has numerous implications and negative effects on schools, including the current national United States teacher shortage. The overall goal of my research was to ascertain the effects of teacher directed violence and report possible prevention, intervention, and solutions to this problem. So, beginning with some important definitions, we are defining school violence. So, school violence is violence that occurs in a school setting. School is the location where the violence occurs, not a type of violence. Instead, there are many types of school violence or forms of school violence that include physical violence, psychological violence, sexual violence, bullying, and cyberbullying. Victims vary and they range from students, teachers, administrators, and other school personnel. School violence can happen for many reasons. There are external factors that influence school violence and internal factors as well. So, those external factors are going to be family. So, family structure, dysfunction, abuse, maltreatment, domestic violence. We also have exposure to community violence, including access to weapons, drug and alcohol abuse, and gang affiliation, parent and community involvement, and media exposure to violence. Internal factors include bullying, which is identified as the number one source of victimization and violent behavior in youth, a lack of training. So, improperly trained teachers won't notice signs of violence and fail to respond accordingly. A poor school climate creates a breeding ground for violence, especially when rules and procedures are not being enforced. Students and staff feel unsafe in these environments. And finally, overcrowding in schools can actually influence violence in that it prevents teachers from forming meaningful relationships with their students and maintaining those relationships when they have just so many students on their caseload. So, like I said, when it comes to student victims, the data is well developed, it is clear. However, there is a lack of data that investigates violence directed towards school personnel. So, the majority of my research was focused on teacher directed violence. So, we took that definition of school violence and we made it a little more specific to teachers. So, teacher directed violence is defined as teacher targeted aggression in the form of harassment, property destruction, and physical aggression and bullying. So, this includes a wide range of behaviors, including obscene remarks, gestures, verbal threats, intimidation, cyber violence, theft, or damage to personal property, including throwing objects, physical attacks, and even weapons being pulled. Perpetrators of teacher directed violence include students, parents, and even colleagues. So, in my research, there were several studies that had actually began to identify the most frequently experienced forms of teacher-directed violence, and they are listed below. The first one is harassment as the most frequently experienced form of teacher-directed violence. The second one is property offenses, so destruction of property or throwing objects. And the last one was physical aggression. It was the least common of the categories, but it was still relatively frequently occurring. Um, Around 40% of teachers have experienced some type of physical aggression. That was higher in lower grade levels. Physical aggression was higher in lower grade levels, while harassment and property offenses were higher in the older grade levels. So just under 50% of all teachers report experiences of teacher directed violence, and 48% of that time, the perpetrator of the violence is a student. I next dove into my research and looked at teacher perceptions of teacher directed violence and where do they come from and what do teachers identify as the causes of teacher directed violence. So there were a few themes that developed from this. The first one, self-efficacy. So self-efficacy actually deals with teachers who feel they are ineffectively able to manage behaviors, and that actually creates an environment where they are more at risk of teacher directed violence. So, self doubt or cultural differences hinder their ability to confront violent behaviors in the classroom. And because they are unable to confront them, they are unable to effectively manage that classroom behavior. So, teachers who are most likely at risk for low self efficacy are your pre service or student teachers or your early career teachers. They just do not have the experience or the confidence to deal with violent issues in the classroom, and that unresponsiveness actually creates an environment where they are more at risk of encountering teacher directed violence. So, low self efficacy leads to strong feelings of stress, of disengagement, which also lead into teacher burnout. Coupled with low self efficacy, we have lack of status, which is the perceptions that teachers don't have professional respect or admiration, and that further contributes to their low self efficacy. The second emergent theme was victimization. So, teachers who are victims of school violence or frequently observe school violence have lower perceptions of school safety. And this kind of goes into that third one that's on the list, which is school climate. So, those feelings of being unsafe in their work environment are actually associated with higher reporting rates of teachers experiencing teacher directed violence. So when they feel unsafe, things that they would maybe have handled themselves or not necessarily reported as teacher directed violence seem like they are a greater deal than what they would have been. Perceived violence was found to be related to reports of anxiety, depression, and somatic symptoms like headaches in teachers. Again, going on with along with that school climate. School climate was actually found to have a reciprocal relationship with school violence. So perceptions of a good or positive school climate, there were lower perceived teacher directed violence or violence in general, while a poor school climate or a negatively perceived school climate had increased perceptions of school violence. Role and job expectations. This is teachers who actually believe that their job is strictly to teach academic content. So those teachers who are set in the mindset that their job is to educate and to delegate disciplinary action to administrators. Through experience, through literature, it's all shown that the role of an educator has evolved, and it's no longer just about the content that is being taught, but about life skills or the hidden curriculum. Teachers are now expected to handle discipline in-house or within the classroom. So with more interaction with disciplinary problems, there is a higher chance of being exposed to school violence or teacher-directed violence. Lack of autonomy or decision making refers to a sense of loss of control over aspects of your work. So, within this scope of teacher directed violence, this is going to be referring to a loss over or control of the decisions regarding discipline. So, the studies were showing that teachers often felt opinions were ignored regarding disciplinary procedures, and for less desirable disciplinary action or inaction. Um, Teachers felt that they were providing ample behavioral documentation, yet felt nothing was being done to ameliorate the situation. These perceptions of continual loss of power or a lack of decision making or autonomy increased the likelihood that teachers will transfer or resign as a result of exposure to teacher directed violence. And finally, lack of impact. Um, a lot of teachers enter the profession with a hope to leave an impact on their students. Studies have now begun to show that teachers are becoming discouraged in their efforts to help students. For example, teachers feel they're lacking in the ability to make an impact when violent classroom disruptions are so great that they continually prevent learning. Teachers have to stop the lessons repeatedly. They feel like they're doing a disservice to the rest of the class who is there to try to learn to handle just a one or a few students' behaviors, and stopping the class to manage those behaviors puts them at risk of teacher-directed violence if they are in the midst of a violent outburst. Another example, teachers feel that they can't help students through their levels of trauma. Uh, they want to, but they don't feel prepared. They don't feel trained. They don't feel secure enough in their ability to help students through their trauma. So they feel that they can't make a connection or leave an impact on those students. And third, a final example, teachers who continually make an effort, even with those difficult students day after day, are met with pushback from that student, from administrators, because they feel like they're not doing enough. And that sense of unappreciation is discouraging teachers further. So while students were found to be the most frequent perpetrators of teacher-directed violence at 48% of the time, they are not the only ones who are perpetrators of school violence. The next portion of my research dove into parents as perpetrators of teacher-directed violence. Within this category, there was a real lack of literature examining the role of parent perpetrators of teacher-directed violence. The studies that did exist cited parent perpetrators about 20 to 40% of the time, depending on your role within the school. So it might be on that lower end, that 20% of the time, if you're a teacher who doesn't have as much time during the day to interact or answer emails or converse with parents as an administrator might have, which would be on that higher end at that 40% of the time. Studies similarly to student perpetrators, the most frequently occurring forms of teacher-directed violence were verbal harassment, followed by property damage, and physical violence, respectively, coming in third. The most frequently cited reasons for parent-teacher conflict were discipline and grades. Administrators were actually more likely to be victims of school violence from parents than teachers were. Administrators act as that front line Um, One of the studies I had read said that administrators act as protectors for teachers, that when parents come to them with issues, they usually ask the administrator to not say anything to the teacher because they don't want any retribution to come back on their student. So when looking at teacher-directed violence towards administrators, or school violence towards administrators from parents, administrators deal with aggressive parent issues, usually stemming from over-parenting. And these fall in the categories of overparenting in academics, in discipline, athletics, and social emotional concerns. Several of the studies cited that administrators spend 2 to 3 hours or upwards of 25 to 50% of their time in a week dealing with parent issues. Aggressive parental behavior is a major concern for future administrators because this is leading to shorter admin tenure, teacher reluctancy to enter administrative positions, decline in career satisfaction, and detrimental health effects like stress, anxiety, and depression, which ultimately lead to burnout and possibly turnover. So, taking into consideration teacher directed violence from student perpetrators and parent perpetrators, um, several themes emerged for implications or effects of teacher directed violence. And the three major ones that encompass a lot of what you see on the screen right here are burnout, turnover, and shortages. So, starting with burnout, this was the most frequently cited implication or effect of teacher directed violence. And burnout refers to the chronic work related stress resulting in negative emotions, attitudes, and a lack of accomplishment. This reduces control over your job and it affects your efficiency in your job. This contributes to a deteriorating school climate, which, as stated earlier, is a breeding ground for school violence, and has that reciprocal relationship with school violence. So, as the climate deteriorates, the perception of school violence increases. A decline in job satisfaction, poor work life balance, as well as many mental health issues or even physical health issues. This is impactful on the whole school community. The second most common theme throughout all of the literature was going to be turnover. Studies have shown that many teachers decide to leave the profession entirely within their first 3 to 5 years of teaching. So, directly correlating with that low self efficacy that was discussed in teacher perceptions of school violence, it's those pre service and early career teachers that are most likely to be at risk for teacher directed violence due to low self efficacy and lack of status. When teachers leave the profession, this has amplifying effects on the achievement gap, which disproportionately affects schools with increased minority populations and schools with low performance. The studies that I examine show that teachers are more likely to request transfers or resign from the profession after encounters with teacher directed violence. This has an effect ultimately on the pool of potential new administrators as that pool decreases, and it also decreases achievement levels for students within the school. In addition to that, with teacher turnover and shortages, you're going to be seeing increased class sizes within schools, reduction in class offerings, as there's not as many teachers to teach those classes, obstruction of curriculum improvements, because teachers are covering for um, open positions, obstruction of teacher collaboration. They're not allowed, or they wouldn't be able to have those collaborative meetings to improve upon teaching strategies and curriculum. We have hiring of inexperienced or unqualified teachers, some of which we have seen in the media today regarding the teacher shortage, and an increased financial burden on the districts seeking to employ more students. Going more on that teacher shortage, the National Education Association has reported that there is 567,000 fewer educators today since the pandemic started in 2020. 90% of NEA members cited burnout as the serious problem impacting educators today. And one of the causes of burnout is teacher-directed violence. The rates of interest in leaving the profession are at a high. Around 29 to 34% of teachers are interested or looking to leave the profession. Of those teachers who are looking to leave, the main cited reason was school climate and safety concerns. As you can see, the implications and effects of teacher-directed violence are numerous. The three main, burnout, turnover, and shortages, all have a profound impact on students, on schools, on the community, and we are really looking at a serious problem if we cannot correct or prevent these acts of school violence or teacher-directed violence from occurring in schools. The next portion of my research was dedicated into looking at intervention or preventions to stop or mitigate school violence. And I had come up with a comprehensive list of all that was suggested within the literature of ways that schools can intervene and help prevent school violence. The first one is establishing mental health programs for students and staff. So this is increasing the number of social workers, of school counselors, of school psychologists that the students and staff have access to help them with their social emotional skills, with coping techniques, with trauma, to conduct threat assessments, to really just assist in that mental health well-being. The second suggestion is promoting trauma-informed practices in schools. So trauma-informed practices takes into consideration how trauma affects childhood development. Children walk into school every single day with varying levels of trauma. And that trauma impacts their ability to learn, it impacts their ability to socialize, and training teachers in trauma-informed practices can mitigate school violence because it's really seeking to understand mental health concerns and what our students truly need from us before they are able to tackle the academics. It's an alternative to zero tolerance policies, which are exclusionary and disproportionately affect minority groups as well. The third suggestion is including staff and parents in decision making, increasing funding for schools for these mental health resources like additional social workers, counselors, and psychologists, evidence-based trainings in trauma-informed practices, and reduction of exclusionary discipline policies. This also goes into number 4, which is the promotion of restorative practices as well. So, all trauma informed practices and restorative practices are alternate models of discipline. So, these alternate models based on restorative justice or threat assessment or problem solving are identified as more effective responses to school violence. In the past, zero tolerance policies like in school suspension or out of school suspension actually have been shown to exacerbate problems and cause additional disruption within the school day. So, restorative practices and trauma informed practices work together to mitigate violence by teaching developmental SEL skills like empathy, awareness, and accountability. And it creates a sense of community that holds the students accountable. So, what was the harm? Who did it harm? How did it affect them? And what can we do to fix this situation going forward? Restorative practices and trauma informed practices can be a foundation to reducing school violence by really understanding students and working with them, not against them. Positive results from trauma informed practices and restorative practices include reduction in conflict, reduction in risky behavior, and absenteeism. And we have increased well-being, increased interpersonal relationships, and increased academic achievement. The 5th one on the list, conducting anonymous assessments to assess stressors, wellness, and other needs for all. And all is not just students, this is staff as well, to see what the needs are and what assistance or further assistance can be provided. And finally, improving educator preparation programs for our pre-service and early career teachers. So, providing additional training to our pre-service teachers or student teachers on social emotional learning and trauma-informed practices, they will feel more confident in preventing classroom issues and handling them when they do arise. It's really a disservice to not properly equip our new teachers for real world experiences in the program or in the classroom. Make sure that they understand the demands of the job before entering so that they don't become victims of teacher directed violence, of burnout. That they should know that they are not just teaching academic content, but they are teaching that hidden curriculum as well, that social emotional well-being, cultural norms, language, relationship building, cooperation, proper training in all of these things, trauma-informed practices, restorative practices, can prevent burnout and turnover. So, in conclusion of all this research, teacher-directed violence is multifaceted in its causes. So, why does it happen? And the forms that it happens in. It is not just a U.S. problem, but a world problem. There were several countries that had provided studies into teacher-directed violence, including Australia, Estonia, Finland, Germany, Belgium, Canada. There were studies coming out of all of these areas of the world involving teacher-directed violence. The implications and effects of teacher-directed violence are numerous and should be a extreme cause for concern, looking at the list of negative effects caused from teacher-directed violence, leading to burnout, turnover, and shortages. Preparation and prevention are key to reducing teacher-directed violence and its negative effects. So making sure our teachers come out of college prepared for encounters in a classroom of their own, and making sure our veteran teachers are staying up to date with current trainings in trauma-informed practices, restorative practices, and other alternative disciplinary practices. Thank you for listening to my research. I hope that you found this enlightening or insightful in some way. I really enjoyed researching this topic, and I'm looking forward to looking or researching more about it, or developing more about it in the future. Thank you.